My father spent 40 years building something real, and his brother spent 40 years watching him do it. When Dad died, my uncle didn't even wait for the reception to end before he started making phone calls. My name is Walter Beaumont. I'm 43 years old. I live in Kelowna, British Columbia, and I run a business that my father started with a second-hand refrigerated van, a commercial kitchen license, and a stubbornness that I now understand was genetic. For most of my adult life, I thought that being the peacekeeper in our family was a virtue. I thought that staying quiet when things felt wrong was the mature choice. I was wrong about both of those things, and the cost of being wrong was 6 months of the worst year of my life, and one morning in a notary's office in downtown Kelowna that I will never forget as long as I live. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. My father, Gordon Beaumont, started Beaumont Fine Foods in 1984 out of a rented unit in a light industrial park off Highway 97. He was 31 years old, freshly married to my mother, Anne, and absolutely certain that the Okanagan was going to grow. He was right about that. What he built over the next 4 decades was a specialty food distribution company, local cheeses, small batch preserves, artisan charcuterie, regional wines, supplying independent grocery stores, restaurants, and hotel kitchens across the interior and lower mainland. By the time I was old enough to work summers loading the vans, the company had 17 employees and a reputation that opened doors in Vancouver that took other distributors years to knock on. By the time I graduated from the University of British Columbia in 2003 with a degree in business administration and came home to work alongside him, Beaumont Fine Foods had 31 employees, a climate-controlled warehouse, and contracts with some of the most respected restaurants in the province. My father was not a man who spoke about money. He spoke about relationships. He would tell you the name of every chef who had ever taken a chance on one of his suppliers. He remembered the year each account started. He knew which restaurant owners had gone through divorces, which ones had kids in university, which ones needed an extra 30 days on their invoice when things got tight. That was the business, not the product, the trust. He drove a 10-year-old Silverado that he refused to replace because, as he said, it still starts. He wore the same canvas jacket to every trade show from Penticton to Vancouver. He made the same lunch every day, a toasted egg salad sandwich and a thermos of black tea, at his desk at 12:15, because he said the lunch hour was when the phones went quiet and he could actually think. He was also a man with a brother who had never quite forgiven him for succeeding. My uncle, Dennis Beaumont, was 58 years old when my father died. He was 2 years younger than Dad, lived in West Kelowna, and had spent most of his career in residential real estate, first as an agent and then, for a brief and financially chaotic period in the late 90s, as a developer. The development venture had not gone well. Dad had helped him out of that quietly, with a loan that Dennis never repaid and, as far as I could tell, never felt particularly troubled by not repaying. Their relationship afterward had the texture of something stretched too tight, functional at family dinners, careful at holidays, never quite honest underneath. Dennis had a son, my cousin Jarrett, who was 36 and worked, loosely speaking, in digital marketing out of an apartment in Burnaby. Jarrett had the easy confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything and considered this a personality trait. My mother passed away in the spring of 2017, a long illness that my father handled the same way he handled everything, quietly, methodically, and without complaint. After she was gone, the house felt different when I visited, not empty exactly, more like a building whose center beam had been quietly removed. Dad kept working. He said it helped. I believed him because I understood it. He never remarried. He never came close, as far as I knew. He was not a man who was built for loneliness, but he was also not a man who was built for pretending. And I think he knew, even then, who would circle if he showed any. He was diagnosed with a progressive pulmonary condition in early 2021. COPD compounded by fibrosis. His respirologist at Kelowna General described it in the particular careful language doctors use when the news is real and the timeline is uncertain. He managed it. He slowed down. He gave me more operational authority over the company, officially, with paperwork, the way he did everything. He still came in 3 days a week. He still made his egg salad sandwich. He still knew every account by name. He passed away in February 2023. He was 70 years old. He died at home the way he would have wanted, early on a Tuesday morning. I got the call from his housekeeper at 6:52 a.m. I drove from my place in the Lower Mission neighborhood across to the family home in Glenmore in weather that was still dark and cold and smelled like frozen pine. He looked exactly like himself, which is the truest thing I can tell you. like a man who had finished something. The funeral was held the following Saturday. The church on Benvolen Road was full of people who had known him in different chapters, old suppliers, longtime customers, former employees, neighbors from 30 years back, men in their 60s and 70s who gripped my hand and told me things about my father that he would have been embarrassed to hear. I was grateful for every single word. Dennis arrived with Jarrett and sat in the third row. He cried at the appropriate moments. He said the right things at the reception. He was gracious in the way that people are gracious when they believe they are about to receive something. I should have seen it coming faster than I did. 8 days after the funeral, I received a registered letter. It was from a solicitor named Hugh Parrish, of Parrish and Crowley LLP in downtown Kelowna, informing me that he was acting on behalf of Dennis Beaumont, and that pursuant to a will executed by Gordon Beaumont in March 2022, my uncle had been named a co-beneficiary of the estate, specifically including a 49% interest in Beaumont Fine Foods Inc., and a right of first refusal on the remaining 51% held by any other beneficiary. I read the letter twice standing at my kitchen counter, with my coat still on. There was a clause. The clause stated that if the primary beneficiary, me, chose to retain operational control of the company, Dennis would be entitled to a formal valuation and buyout of his 49% interest within 18 months, or alternatively, Dennis could elect to take his interest in kind, meaning he would become a direct co-owner of the business. I want to be honest about what happened inside me when I read that. There was anger, real anger, the fast, hot kind, and then, almost immediately, something else. Something that felt less like emotion and more like machinery, a gear engaging, because something didn't fit. My father was not a man who made careless decisions, and a 49% interest for Dennis, who had never set foot inside the warehouse, never met a single supplier, never attended a single account meeting, that was not a decision my father would have made carelessly, or at all. I called my father's longtime solicitor that same afternoon. Her name is Margaret Foss. She is 61 years old. A business and estate lawyer based in Kelowna who had handled my father's corporate and personal legal work for over 20 years. She is precise in the way that people are when their precision has saved other people from disaster many times over. Margaret had also, as it happened, drafted my father's previous will, the one from 2019, and had not been involved in the March 2022 document that Hugh Parrish was now referencing. She answered on the third ring. "Walter, I've been expecting you to call. Tell me about the March 2022 will." A pause. "Come in tomorrow morning. There are things I need to walk you through in person." I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the kitchen and I made black tea the way my father made it, steeped too long, and I thought about things I should have paid closer attention to. The way Dennis had started calling Dad more frequently in late 2021. The lunch in Westbank in January 2022 that Dad had mentioned and then not mentioned again. The fact that I had noticed both of those things at the time and filed them somewhere low in my attention, because I was running the company and managing my father's declining health, and I had told myself I was being uncharitable. I was not being uncharitable. I was being accurate and choosing not to act on it, which is a different problem entirely. Margaret's office is on Lawrences Avenue, 4th floor, with a view of Knox Mountain that she has probably stopped seeing because it has been there every morning for 20 years. She was at her desk when I arrived at 8:45, a thick folder already open in front of her, and 2 mugs of coffee on the table. She didn't make me wait for it. "Your father came to see me in October 2022, she said. 8 months after the March will was executed. He was concerned about several things. About some financial decisions that had come to his attention. About a conversation he had apparently had with Dennis in early 2022 that he described to me as pressure that he hadn't fully recognized as pressure until afterward. I sat with that. He signed the March will voluntarily." Margaret looked at me steadily. "He did, but he told me in October that he believed he had signed it during a period when his respiratory condition was being poorly managed and when Dennis had been spending a significant amount of time with him, driving him to appointments, staying for dinner, making himself indispensable in the particular way that some people do when they identify an opportunity. My father had been a man in his late 60s with a progressive illness, living alone, and his younger brother had shown up with casseroles and offers of help, and Dad had told himself it was family. "What did he do about it?" I asked. Margaret opened the folder. What my father had done, between October 2022 and November of the same year, in 6 weeks of careful documented work with Margaret and a corporate restructuring specialist she had brought in, was quietly and completely reorganized the legal and operational architecture of Beaumont Fine Foods. The company had been held as a Canadian-controlled private corporation under his personal ownership. What Margaret helped him do was establish a family trust, the Gordon R. Beaumont Family Trust, and transfer the operating assets of the business into a new holding structure. The physical warehouse, the fleet, the supplier contracts, the customer accounts, the company's trade relationships and goodwill. All of it was transferred into a numbered holding company controlled by the trust. The trust's designated beneficiary for business succession was Walter Gordon Beaumont. Me. What remained in the original Beaumont Fine Foods Inc. The entity named in the March 2022 will was a corporate shell, a clean filing with the BC Registry, a name, a history. Zero operating assets, zero receivables, zero equipment, zero contractual relationships. Net value for all practical purposes, nothing. The March 2022 will was valid. It had been executed correctly and witnessed properly, and Dennis's lawyer had every right to rely on it. Dennis was entitled to 49% of Beaumont Fine Foods Inc. He would receive exactly that. I understood what my father had done before Margaret finished explaining it. I had grown up in that business. I had spent 20 years watching him build things that were meant to outlast moments of weakness. He had done it again, even at the end, with a narrowed airway and a brother he didn't want to believe was doing what he was doing. He had been methodical. He had been thorough. He had built something. There is a version of this where I go to war immediately, where I hire the most aggressive litigator in the interior and file everything I can file and make it as expensive and painful as possible. I understood that impulse. I won't pretend I didn't. But Margaret said something to me that morning that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Your father didn't restructure this business to start a fight. He restructured it to make the fight unnecessary. Let the paperwork do what he built it to do." So I didn't contest the March will. I didn't challenge Dennis's entitlement. I instructed Margaret to contact Hugh Parrish and confirm that I was prepared to honor my father's wishes in full. Dennis Beaumont was welcome to his 49% interest in Beaumont Fine Foods Inc. as specified. I had no objection to the transfer proceeding as quickly as the estate process allowed. Hugh Parrish, Margaret told me later, had gone quiet on the phone for a moment. He had expected opposition. He had prepared for it. The absence of it apparently made him more cautious, not less. Good, Margaret had said. He should be. During the weeks between my father's funeral and the estate meeting, I kept the business running. Our operations manager, a woman named Suzanne Hebert, 47 years old, who had been with the company for 14 years, and whom my father had trusted with every key in the building, knew about the restructuring. She had been briefed by my father and by Margaret. She ran the floor with the particular competence of someone who understands that accounts don't pause for family drama, and that the people whose paychecks depend on the company being functional deserve better than uncertainty. The 31 employees kept coming in. The deliveries kept running. The invoices kept going out. The accounts didn't know anything had changed, because for them, nothing had. The holding structure insulated operations completely from the estate proceedings. That was the point. I had one direct conversation with Dennis during that period. He called on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the funeral, while I was sitting in my truck outside the warehouse finishing a call with a new supplier in the Similkameen Valley. I almost didn't pick up. I picked up. Walter. His voice had that particular warmth that certain people deploy the way a contractor deploys scaffolding. Functional, temporary, not meant to last. "I just want you to know I have no interest in making this difficult. Your father wanted us to share in what he built. I think we can do that like adults." I said, "I agree completely. My lawyer is working with Hugh to move the transfer forward." A pause. That's good to hear. "I expected more resistance from you, honestly." I said, "Dad's wishes are clear. I'm not going to stand in the way of that." Another pause. Longer. Dennis was a man who was good at reading rooms. He could feel that something was off balance, but he couldn't find what it was. I know he was calculating in that silence. I could almost hear it. "I think this can be a new chapter," he said finally. "For both of us," I said. "I hope so. I'll have Margaret follow up with Hugh this week." I finished my call with the Similkameen supplier after Dennis hung up. The Okanagan was doing that thing it does in late March, where the days are cold but the light has changed, and you can see the snow pulling back from the lower hillsides above the lake. I sat there for a few minutes before I went back inside. I thought about my father driving this same stretch of highway in 1984 with a refrigerated van and $12,000 worth of belief in what the valley was going to become. He'd been right about so many things. I was starting to understand that this had been one of them. The estate meeting was set for a Thursday morning in mid-April. The offices of Sutton and Associates, an estate administration firm on Water Street in downtown Kelowna, across from the waterfront park where the cherry trees were just beginning to come out. Margaret came with me. Her associate, a younger man named Christopher Dell, who handled the trust documentation and had what Margaret described as an unusually tidy mind for corporate mechanics, was there as well. Dennis arrived with Hugh Parrish at 9:10. Dennis was dressed in the way that people dress when they want to appear successful at a meeting, where they expect to become more so. Good blazer, careful haircut, the posture of a man who has already rehearsed the conversation going well. Hugh Parrish was a competent-looking man in his early 60s, gray-suited, thorough in the way that estate solicitors tend to be, who shook Margaret's hand with the cautious courtesy of opposing counsel. We sat down. The estate trustee, a notary named Brian Kwan from the firm, walked through the proceedings. He confirmed the validity of the March 2022 will. He confirmed that the primary beneficiary, Walter Beaumont, had not filed any opposition to its terms. He asked Margaret formally whether her client had any objection to the transfer of the 49% interest in Beaumont Fine Foods Inc. to Dennis Beaumont as specified. Margaret said, "None at all. Mr. Beaumont is in complete agreement with the transfer as documented." Dennis exhaled, not loudly. Just the small release of a man who has been braced for a fight and is relieved to be told there isn't one. Hugh's shoulders dropped perhaps a quarter inch. I watched it happen. Brian Kwan proceeded to the asset schedule, the supporting documentation that itemized the holdings of Beaumont Fine Foods Inc. as of the date of transfer. It was a legal requirement. The schedule had to be reviewed and acknowledged before the transfer could be formally recorded. Hugh reached for the document first. That was his job. He opened it. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He stopped. I watched Hugh Parrish the way you watch a structure when you suspect there's a load it wasn't built to carry. He didn't move for a moment. Just stillness. The particular stillness of a man whose brain has registered something that his professional composure hasn't finished deciding how to respond to. He read the line again. The one that described the assets currently held by Beaumont Fine Foods Inc. as of the date of transfer following the October-November 2022 corporate restructuring into the Gordon R. Beaumont Family Trust. Total net asset value, 0. He took his glasses off, set them down on the table with the precision of a man buying himself 2 seconds. He looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this moment since October and finds it exactly as expected. "Counsel," Hugh said, "I'd like to request a short recess." Brian Kwan granted it. Dennis leaned toward Hugh immediately. His voice was low, but not as low as he intended. "What is this? What does that number mean?" Hugh put a hand lightly on Dennis's arm. "Let's step out." They went into the hallway. I stayed in my seat. Christopher Dell poured water from the carafe on the table and slid a glass to me without being asked. He had the demeanor of a man who had placed everything exactly where it needed to be and was simply waiting for the inventory to be taken. Margaret glanced at me. "You all right?" "I'm good," I said. And I was. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see Dennis's face changing. He was a man who had been patient for a long time. Patient through my father's building years. Patient through the loan that was never mentioned again. Patient through decades of watching from the outside while something valuable grew. He had made his move. He had waited until the moment of maximum vulnerability, a sick man, alone, in need of company. And he had been gentle and present and useful, and he had got what he wanted on paper. And now Hugh was showing him what the paper was actually worth. I watched Dennis read the document. I watched his head come back up. I watched confusion become disbelief, and then become something sharper and colder. He came back through the door without waiting for Hugh to finish speaking. "What did you do?" He was looking at me, not shouting. Something worse than shouting. The controlled voice of a man who knows that shouting will cost him more than he has left. "What did you do to this company?" I looked at him. "I didn't do anything to the company, Dennis. Dad did 14 months ago. You can't. He restructured this to cut me out. That's not legal. That's a fraudulent transfer." Margaret said, without any particular emphasis. Mr. Beaumont was the sole owner and director of a private corporation. He exercised his legal right to restructure its asset holdings. The restructuring was completed in November 2022, fully documented, with a clear business rationale and a complete paper trail. The will your client is relying on was executed in March 2022, 7 months before the restructuring. Your client is entitled to everything that will specifies. Hugh had come back in. He had his hand on Dennis's shoulder now, the practiced gesture of a lawyer managing a moment that is getting away from him. Dennis, please. Dennis sat down. He was breathing carefully, the breathing of a person who is trying to keep something in. The meeting resumed. Brian Kwan completed the transfer. 49% of Beaumont Fine Foods Inc. was formally recorded in Dennis Beaumont's name. He received exactly what the will specified. The company name. A shell with no employees, no contracts, no equipment, no receivables, no supplier relationships, no warehouse. A clean CBCA filing and the memory of what the name used to mean. I did not feel triumphant, I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to sorrow than victory. Dennis was my father's brother. He had been at every Christmas dinner I could remember. He had taught me to ski at Big White when I was 9 years old. There was a version of this man who might have been something different. And then there was the version who had identified a window in a dying man's loneliness and climbed through it. I couldn't hold both of those versions equally by the time I walked out of that office onto Water Street, into the April light coming off the lake. Margaret walked with me to my car. The cherry trees along the waterfront were doing exactly what they do every April, indifferent to everything except their own timing. He'll instruct Hugh to challenge the restructuring, she said. Claim it was designed to defeat his inheritance rights. Can he? He can try. BC's Wills, Estates and Succession Act has provisions for court variation of a will where the willmaker failed to make adequate provision, but the variation remedy is primarily for spouses and children. A sibling claiming inadequate provision faces a very high bar, particularly where the willmaker's decision was documented and deliberate. And we have something else. What? She looked at me. When your father came to me in October 2022, he brought documentation, not just instincts. Over the preceding months, he had been quietly going through the company accounts himself, the way a man does when he started not trusting something but can't name it yet. He found payment records, wire transfers from the company's operating account in 2021 and early 2022, during the period when Dennis had started spending significant time with him and had asked, as a favor, casually, during one of those dinners, to be added as an authorized contact on one of the company's vendor accounts. I went still. How much? I asked. Margaret told me. $41,000 over 9 months. Transferred to a numbered company registered in Alberta with no discernible business relationship to Beaumont Fine Foods. Margaret had flagged it to the company's accountant, a careful woman named Diane Fortin, who had been handling the books for 11 years, and who had described the pattern, when she found it, with the measured precision of someone choosing their words very carefully. Margaret hadn't filed it anywhere yet. She had been waiting for the estate proceedings, because under BC law, financial misconduct affecting the estate is relevant to any variation claim, and the court has discretion to take it into account. She had waited, and now she had somewhere to file it. Hugh Parrish received a formal notice of the financial records 2 weeks after the estate meeting. He took 4 days to respond. When he did, it was a single sentence acknowledging receipt. 11 days after that, he filed a notice of withdrawal, citing a conflict of interest. The next call came from a new solicitor, a woman named Andrea Kowalczyk, based in Vernon, whom Dennis had retained after Hugh's departure. Andrea was sharp and direct, and she understood almost immediately what position her client was actually in. She called Margaret on a Tuesday afternoon. Dennis will release all claims against the estate, the trust, and the numbered holding company, Andrea said. He will sign a full acknowledgement that the restructuring was valid and will not be challenged. In return, the financial records are treated as settled internally and are not referred to the RCMP Commercial Crime section. Margaret brought it to me the following evening. We sat in her office on Lawrence Avenue with the last of the light going orange over Knox Mountain, and she told me what it meant and what it didn't mean. What she didn't say, and didn't need to say, is that my father had known this was coming. Not this specific meeting, not this specific number, not these specific documents, but something like it. He had known who his brother was, the way you know things you spend decades trying not to know. And at the end, when the clarity that comes with running out of time had burned away everything non-essential, he had done the one thing he had always done. He had built something that would hold. I signed the settlement on a Friday morning in May. I drove from Margaret's office down to the warehouse on Sexsmith Road and pulled into the yard and sat in the truck for a few minutes before I went inside. Suzanne had the morning crew running a route to Penticton, the van's already out. The cooler unit on the loading dock was humming the way it always did. The inventory board showed 3 new accounts that Suzanne had brought in the previous week, 2 restaurants in Oliver, and a specialty grocer in Summerland who had been loyal to a competitor for years before reaching out last month. 31 people. Not one of them had missed a paycheck. Not one account had been left uninformed about the transition. The business had kept moving because my father had built it to keep moving, and because the people he'd trusted to run it had done exactly that. I walked the floor. I checked the cold storage temperature log. I read the delivery manifest for the Penticton run. I did the ordinary things that keep ordinary commerce alive. My father used to say that the most important thing in this business wasn't the product. It was the follow-through, showing up, calling when you said you'd call, delivering what you promised, at the temperature you promised, to the door you said you'd be at. Every time. Not because it was profitable in the short term. Because trust was the only thing in this business that you couldn't replace once you'd lost it. I have been thinking about that a great deal in the months since. There's something I want to say clearly before I'm done, because this channel is about more than what happened. It's about what it means. My father was 70 years old when he died. He had a progressive illness that made every year after 2021 harder than the year before. He was alone in a house where the person he had most loved was no longer present. And in that condition, with compressed lungs and a brother, who had started making himself useful at exactly the right moment, he had the presence of mind to be suspicious, to investigate, to document, to restructure, and to protect 31 people who depended on a business they had given their working lives to. He didn't do it out of bitterness. He wasn't a bitter man. He did it because he understood what the business actually was. It wasn't a number on a balance sheet. It was 31 households. It was 20 years of supplier relationships built one honest transaction at a time. It was every chef who had taken his call, and every grocer who had taken his word. He wasn't going to let that become the subject of a dispute between a man who had never packed a single delivery van and a son who had never asked for anything more than the chance to keep building what his father had built. I spent years being careful with Dennis, polite at the dinners, generous with the benefit of the doubt, always finding the charitable interpretation. Some of that came from love. I did love him, in the complicated way you love people you've known your whole life. But some of it came from conflict avoidance, which is a different thing entirely and one I understand now as a weakness I was performing as a strength. The lesson I take from this is not that family is dangerous. The lesson is that love and documentation are not in opposition. You can love a person and still know what the accounts say. You can honor a relationship and still read every paragraph of every document that relationship produces. You can extend trust and still verify where the money goes. My father knew. He knew later than I wish he had, and he never said so to me directly, which is also something I carry. But when he knew, he acted. He was thorough and he was quiet, and he built something that held when it needed to hold. That is the only inheritance that mattered. Not the assets, not the name on the filing, not the shell that Dennis signed for and has not done a single thing with since April. The methodology, the discipline, the understanding that what you build is only as permanent as the structure you put under it. The business is running, the accounts are good. The vans go out every morning at 6, and every day at 12:15, I make a toasted egg salad sandwich and a thermos of black tea, and I eat it at my desk while the phones go quiet and I think. That is when I do my best thinking. My father taught me that.